Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. On Tuesday, Senator Raphael Warnock won the Georgia Senate runoff by a pretty resounding margin, about 3 points, compared to about 1 point that he led Herschel Walker, the Republican candidate, in November. Kim, what's your read of these results and any takeaways for each side?
Well, the takeaway for Republicans is, oh my goodness, you didn't manage to pick up a single Senate seat this cycle. And you might want to look at why that was, because again, Republicans not only failed to pick up Arizona, New Hampshire, now Georgia, but they also lost a Pennsylvania seat. And so this means Democrats have expanded their majority. It will now be 51-49 in the Senate. That means, for instance, that the Senate Judiciary Committee, instead of being 11-11, will now be 12-10. That is going to make it a whole lot easier for Democrats to rubber stamp Joe Biden's judicial nominees. And Republicans might want to consider what Mitch McConnell had to say a few months ago. It upset a bunch of them. But when he said candidate quality matters, that certainly seems to be the common factor in all of these Senate losses. Because if you look around, it's not that Republicans couldn't win in those states. There were Republicans that did win statewide in those states. Look at Brian Kemp in Georgia, for instance. But in this particular situation, the Senate candidates were very poor. Most of them were tied to Donald Trump. You look at the results, and the numbers certainly suggest that this turned off a lot of center of the road, moderate and suburban voters who did not turn out for Walker in this particular case. So I guess that would be the big takeaway for Republicans, that and that they need to get their game on in terms of early voting and mail-in voting, where Democrats continue to outpace them. I think that there's a lot of high-fiving right now saying that Georgia is definitively a swing state. I think it is certainly turned more in that direction. And I think the problem with candidate quality certainly highlighted the ability for Democrats to make inroads in states that have traditionally been more Republican. But I would argue that to read into this, that this is a new Democratic mandate in that state or in the nation's capital would be overreading this result. It was still a pretty close race. 51-49 is still a pretty close Senate. People are still pretty unhappy with Joe Biden and his policies, and that would be something Democrats ought to absorb as they go about their next stage in their agenda.
I would underline President Trump's responsibility here in picking these candidates, and we've talked about that some. We did after November 8th, after candidates in Arizona and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania lost. But there's something special, I think, about Georgia, because President Trump makes endorsements of all kinds. Sometimes he is jumping on the bandwagon of a candidate that seems to be catching fire, sometimes at the last minute. But this was a case, Monet, where Donald Trump really cleared the Republican field for Herschel Walker. And as early as March of 2021, this is what Trump was saying: wouldn't it be fantastic if the legendary Herschel Walker ran for the United States Senate in Georgia? He would be unstoppable. There were news stories at the time about other Republicans who were concerned about Herschel Walker's vulnerabilities as a candidate. We're trying to get somebody else into that race who is credible. There was talk of trying to convince David Perdue, the former Georgia senator who lost the 2021 runoff, trying to convince him to run again and see if Republicans could pick this seat back up. One thing I will say on Herschel Walker's behalf, though, is I think he conceded in a good manner, a manner that we've become unused to in certain races. This is from his speech on Tuesday night.
I want to thank Team Herschel, thank all my donors as well, because you guys, without you, I couldn't have done what I've done. So I want to thank all of you as well, because there's no excuses in life. And I'm not going to make any excuses now, because we put up one heck of a fight. And I said, that's what we got to do, because this is much bigger. This is much bigger than Herschel Walker.
Monet, it's great to hear that again from a losing candidate. And I just checked President Trump's Truth Social feed. No statement yet from him, but it will be interesting to see when he weighs in on Georgia.
Yeah, I agree about Herschel Walker's concession. It's very refreshing to hear a losing candidate accept defeat with grace. The vote total seems to be almost in at this point, and basically the margin of victory for Warnock is not maybe as huge as some of the polls were suggesting, or even as I predicted it would be. It was still within 3 points, but decisive enough that there isn't really a need for recount or contestation of any kind. And for Herschel Walker, who obviously did defend President Trump and defend the former president's denials of the 2020 election outcome, for Walker to here sort of be very willing to gracefully accept defeat is, I think, noteworthy and hopefully will set the tone for future candidates. I did want to disagree a little bit with the point you were making about Trump's impact on Walker's nomination. Yes, Trump certainly did try to clear the field on his behalf, and in the end, we saw a very open field. He didn't face that much competition in the nominating contest. But Herschel Walker won with about 68% of the primary vote against several other candidates, maybe not as prominent as David Perdue, but still, I think the fact that he was able to gain such a huge vote total compared with some of the other Trump-picked candidates in other states shows that he probably would have won even without Trump's endorsement. And so I think the impact that Trump did have was in convincing Walker to run in the first place. And so he certainly bears responsibility for that. But I think that a lot of Republicans were excited by the prospect of this football star running, a Black Republican candidate, saw very many reasons to buy in, and that he was going to end up taking that nomination if he decided to run, no matter who went up against him.
One last thought here is on Georgia's election laws and what President Biden predicted last year would be Jim Crow 2.0. And Senator Raphael Warnock in his victory speech touched on this point. So listen to this.
There are those who would look at the outcome of this race and say that there's no voter suppression in Georgia. Let me be clear. Just because people endured long lines that wrapped around buildings, some blocks long, just because they endured the rain and the cold and all kinds of tricks in order to vote, doesn't mean that voter suppression does not exist. It simply means that you, the people, have decided that your voices will not be silenced.
Kim, I take the point about lines, though I think Republican state officials would say that elections in the U.S. are decentralized, and the people who are responsible for those precincts and setting up those polling sites and getting the equipment and getting people through are the local officials in whatever county you happen to be in looking at the line. But it does strike me that the voter suppression narrative has gotten to be a little bit unfalsifiable.
Right. It's convenient to say this because you cannot prove otherwise. But look, it's nonsense. And I think it's notable that Warnock felt the need to throw that out there. It's because it's been so humiliating to the president and Democrats who lost their wig over this Georgia voting reform and proclaimed it Jim Crow 2.0 and suggested there was going to be vast voter suppression. We've had record turnout numbers in Georgia on many different fronts, whether it's day-to-day counts and early voting, whether it was a general election. Voting for this runoff was down a bit compared to the election a couple of weeks ago, but that's normal. That is what normally happens. You don't have as much enthusiasm for runoffs usually as general elections when more people are on the ballot. Also, there's a bit of exhaustion in Georgia. They've been having a lot of votes dealing with Raphael Warnock. And by the way, credit to him that his people continued to show up throughout many, many votes over the last 2 years for the Senate seat. But those numbers blow a complete hole in the argument that there is any sort of voter suppression going on. And they can twist it as much as they want. And yes, it's convenient. As you said, it's unfalsifiable. But it doesn't change the fact that this voting law in many ways actually eased voting for a number of people. We're not having, I would also point out, some of the big problems that we did 2 years ago in terms of signature verification, et cetera, which was one of the motivating factors for this law to make sure that it became more clear exactly who had cast a vote for whom and to make sure that fewer ballots were left uncounted. And so in that regard, it's all worked very well.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.